Please welcome our host, Dr. Niall Gardner, Director of Heritage's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom and Bernard and Barbara Lomas Fellow.
Thanks very much. A very warm welcome to our audience here at Heritage and also online on both sides of the Atlantic. Andrew, it's wonderful to have you here with us in Washington. I think you just got in a couple of days ago here in the United States. And I think I've known you now, Andrew, for about a quarter of a century. I think we were first introduced back in the days of Norman Stone as the professor of modern history at Oxford. And Andrew, you've been, without a doubt, I think, one of the most influential British historians of the modern era, not only, of course, in print, but also in broadcast media. And you've been, I think, since the funeral of Princess Diana, the NBC royal broadcaster, and you're known to millions of American television viewers, and you've had a very, very distinguished record as a not only as a historian but also a broadcaster and political commentator as well on many different issues. And it's a real privilege, of course, to talk to you today about your new book, The Last King of America. And in fact, you just won, I believe, the literary prize from the General Society of Colonial Wars, the Distinguished Book Award, and congratulations on that, Andrew.
Thank you.
And I should mention, actually, that Andrew, in fact, interned in Washington back in 1984 for the Senate Steering Committee, which I believe still exists, actually, and an exceptionally sound committee. So your experience of Washington goes back several decades, and I think you worked for Jesse Helms actually when he was the chairman of that committee. So welcome back to Washington, Andrew. And also, Andrew, you've been a counsel to numerous presidents and prime ministers, including George W. Bush. You gave him a lot of advice when he was president. My former boss Margaret Thatcher was a big admirer of your books, especially the history of the English-speaking peoples. And you were appointed by Lady Thatcher to the Margaret Thatcher Archive Trust, a real distinguished honor. And you were, without a doubt, I think, one of Lady Thatcher's very, very favorite historians. And we're delighted here at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, Lady Thatcher's official think tank center, to be hosting you today. And Andrew, I'm going to ask you a few questions about your latest book, but also would love to get your thoughts on a number of other issues as well. I mean, your last book, of course, was on Winston Churchill, and I'll have questions also about Meghan Markle and the current state of the British monarchy, the future of the British monarchy, and one or two questions as well about Brexit and also the situation with US-UK leadership on the world stage. So a very wide-ranging discussion today. So hope you're prepared for all sorts of questions, Andrew. So.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Niall. You've made me feel very old, apart from anything else. But okay, let's kick off. Thanks again.
And Andrew, I have to say that George III is not exactly the most popular figure in the United States. I mean, he has a rather bad sort of press over here, and if anyone's in need of a good sort of PR agency, it's George III probably in the United States. What actually inspired you to write this book? And it is, I have to say, an extremely detailed, thoroughly researched book. It's around 700 pages, I think, Andrew. And this is a real work of art. And what drove you to write this book?
Well, thank you very much. It is 700 pages, but as I was explaining earlier, about a third of it is the paraphernalia that you have at the back, and therefore it's not too off-putting, hopefully, when you actually read it. I've been writing about 18th century and early 19th century subjects for some time. I wrote a biography of Napoleon and the Battle of Waterloo and Wellington and things like that, and it's always struck me that King George III has been fundamentally misunderstood, not just here in America, but also in Britain, where for 200 years the Whig historians essentially made him out to be the same kind of murderous tyrant that one gets in, of course, the Declaration of Independence, but also in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton the Musical. And he wasn't like that at all. Her Majesty the Queen has put some 100,000 pages of his private documents and archives and correspondence and so on onto into the public arena using King's College London and the Royal Archives. And from these pages, one sees that actually he was an extremely charming, good-natured, highly intelligent, enlightened individual, somebody who was immensely cultured, and not at all the sort of murderous sadist of myth.
So, your portrayal of George III, of course, is strikingly different to conventional wisdom. And George III, of course, recently was portrayed in the highly successful, I think, 1994 film, The Madness of King George. Ralph Richardson played the king, and it was nominated, I think, for 14 BAFTAs, 4 Academy Awards as well. What's your response to those who say that George III was just completely batty and mad, and what did they get wrong in their depiction of George III in the film?
Everything. They managed to, and it's perfectly understandable, because for half a century people have thought that he had porphyria, this physiological disease, whereas in fact, as is very clear from the appendix of my book, it wasn't that at all. We get that sense because half a century ago, a mother and son medical team gave completely misleading symptoms to the doctors who came up with this concept of porphyria. In fact, and I'm afraid this isn't necessarily much fun for a family audience, but like yours, but it's basics based on the colour of the king's feces and urine, and it wasn't porphyria. He had actually the type 1, effective type 1A of bipolar disorder. And now that we've got past all of the, we've managed to destigmatize mental illness, thankfully, finally, we don't blame him any longer in the same way that the Whig historians did for so long, for his own madness. And it was a debilitating and tragic disease, and had nothing to do with the American Revolution, owing to the fact that he didn't have any outbreaks of it between 1765 and 1788, 5 years after America had been established. So all of the things basically that we think about George III, that he had porphyria, that this and his obstinacy led to the American Revolution, and also that he was a tyrant. All of these things are wrong.
Andrew, your book has already received a lot of attention in the UK, and I would say overwhelmingly very positive reviews in Britain. How do you think it's going to be received here in the United States? Well,
today is the second day of my 5-week book tour, so you're asking very early on this. I'll be able to tell you much better by Christmas. And like the First World War, it'll all be over by Christmas. But I think overall, America's a mature democracy. It's going to be able to face the fact that, in fact, it's a extremely exceptional country. Because, and I think American exceptionalism is proved by the story of George III, because any number of countries have attempted to, and have succeeded in gaining their freedom and independence from an oppressive regime. You can think of the Israelites against the Egyptians, the Dutch against the Spanish, the Italians against the Austrians, the Greeks against the Turks, you name it. It's a well-known and well-established trope of history. What America did, on the other hand, was exceptional because it actually demanded its independence and sovereignty from a country that was not tyrannizing it. There was no actual oppression. It was one of the freest countries of the world in the 1760s and 1770s. And yet they still wanted their independence. And this was because it was the right time for America. You had 2.5 million people. You had a burgeoning economy growing at about 6% a year. You had more bookshops in Philadelphia than in any other city in the empire. And you had no external threat once the French had been expelled from the continent at the time of the Treaty of Paris. So it was the right time for America to demand its independence. And obviously, it needed, for sheer wartime propaganda reasons, to create this myth of an oppressive tyrant king. In fact, there were any number of tyrants in the late 18th century. One looks at Catherine the Great of Russia, what the French were doing in Corsica, the Spanish in Louisiana, and so on, Prussians. And George III did none of that. He didn't arrest any editors. He didn't stop the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress. He didn't close down newspapers. He only stationed troops in one city, in Boston, from 1768. And these are he allowed the common law system to work, and the taxes that he asked for, including the Stamp Act, were incredibly low. I mean, they were like the equivalent of 2 shillings and 6pence per American per year. So actually, I think it's a tremendously, if I were an American, I'd be immensely proud of the fact that that America grabbed its independence because it wanted its independence and its self-government, not because it was being oppressed, which it wasn't being.
So he was a far more enlightened ruler than his critics have claimed. If George III had actually won the American War of Independence, what do you think the future would have held for America, and would a successive king or queen have granted America independence, say, in the 19th century? So, what would have happened if the British had actually won that war?
Well, if you have Canada, of course, as a template for which becomes self-governing in 1830. So that would have happened. I mean, there was, of course, the whole issue of slavery, which would have undoubtedly led to some kind of a clash. There was also very much a sense that it was coming. As I say, the American independence was an unstoppable force, I think. It was next to impossible to win that war over 3,000 miles anyway, especially with the Germain plan, the strategic plan that the British imposed. The admirals and the generals hated each other. Most of the British bureaucracy didn't get on with each other. There were any numbers of problems, but these were not the king's fault. This was the government's fault. This was Lord North and the cabinet. But ultimately, if the English-speaking peoples had stayed together in the late 18th century and continued, if by the time of the First World War, it would have been impossible for the Germans to have started that war. Because the combined power of Britain and America today would have been impossible to have stood up against. So you don't get a First World War, or the Bolsheviks, or the Nazis. The world would have been a much happier place.
In your view, Andrew, did George III in any way transform the monarchy, and is there a lasting impact today from his approach as king?
Very much, yes.
Yeah.
The modern monarchy stems much more from George III than from Queen Victoria, in my view. When one looks at the modern monarchy and think that George III bought Buckingham Palace, bought the Gold Stage Coach, started the walkabouts, started the whole concept of kings and queens all being buried at Windsor, which he was the first person since Charles I to be. He invented the trooping of the colour, and then personally he was a frugal monarch. When one thinks of the present Queen, and then think George III was a frugal monarch, financially prudent, driven almost entirely by a sense of duty and hard work. That is the Queen today. So yes, I think probably legacy is in the modern monarchy more than anywhere else.
Yes, and this is a good juncture now to switch to the monarchy in modern times, and of course the monarchy has been under a lot of fire in recent months. In fact, we did a public event here at Heritage a few months ago entitled "The Crown Under Fire," talking about largely Meghan Markle's attacks on the monarchy, and how damaging do you think that Meghan Markle's attacks or critiques of the monarchy have been?
Well, they're pretty serious in America, but they're not at all taken terribly seriously in Britain. I mean, the very fact that she didn't name this racist who made these racist remarks in the Oprah Winfrey interview makes some people wonder whether or not she was telling the truth. There are other things that we see from this Daily Mail, huge Daily Mail jury trial that make it clear that she has not been telling the truth about several important aspects of the relationship she had with her biographers. And so people who follow these things are, I think, starting to see a different aspect to her. But I don't think in Britain she's going to cause much trouble. I tell you where she is going to cause some trouble, here in America. Because I can see very clearly her use of her royal status or former royal status being used in American politics, specifically on the side of the Democratic Party. Her recent telephoning of senators, calling herself the Duchess of Sussex and saying that American taxpayers should pick up $1 trillion in paternity leave payments, is something that I think you're going to have to deal with an awful lot more than anything we're going to have to worry about.
Yes, it's striking how, well, firstly, just how popular the monarchy is in the United States. And I think Gallup does fairly regular polling on US attitudes towards the Queen. And the Queen generally has an approval rating around 70% or so among Americans, which is far, far higher than most US presidents, including, of course, Joe Biden, whose approval rating now is around 40%.
I thought it was much lower than that.
And yeah, I think Biden's actually fallen as low as 37, 38 in some polls. So the Queen remains an incredibly well-respected, admired figure in the United States. What do you think the future of the monarchy will be in the era that succeeds Queen Elizabeth II? And she is now 95 years old. When Prince Charles ascends to the throne as king, do you think that the image or the popularity of the monarchy is going to be impacted in a significant way on both sides of the Atlantic?
I really don't know. I see the monarchy as being one of its strengths is that it's just such a continually evolving story that when one chapter closes, another one opens, and so it doesn't need to worry about Rasmussen poll results unless both political or one political party actually embraced republicanism with a small r, which is not about to happen anytime soon. So I think also when you look further on, you see Prince William and Kate, who are tremendously popular, and actually Prince Charles. An awful lot of the things that Prince Charles has been saying over the years have come to pass. You know, he is seen as somebody who sticks his neck out occasionally. He won't be able to do that as king, obviously, because constitutionally he won't be able to make those same kind of statements. But nonetheless, there is a place for him in the hearts of the British people. Whether there is in America, I doubt, frankly. People haven't come round yet also to the Duchess of Cornwall, who is in fact a magnificent woman, but Americans don't seem to appreciate her. So all in all, I think that the institution is going to be fine. And then when Prince William and Kate become king and queen, will become more popular again.
That's very encouraging to hear, Andrew. And your previous book, before your latest book on George III, was Churchill Walking with Destiny, and which I think is an absolutely magnificent addition to the scholarship on Churchill. And in your view, would you regard Churchill as the greatest prime minister of modern times?
Yes, even at the Margaret Thatcher Centre at Heritage Foundation, I would go so far as to say that, Niall. Absolutely. Followed closely by Margaret Thatcher herself.
And
by the way, sorry,
yes.
in Britain, he's under enormous attack at the moment. You know? I mean, there isn't a day goes by when you don't get some article or some new book or some idiot with a spray can attempting to attack the image of Winston Churchill. Earlier this year, we actually had at Churchill College, Cambridge, of all places, a conference in which 4 academics each tried to better each other about being hateful and deeply unhistorical as well about Winston Churchill, until one of them actually said that he was as bad as Hitler, and none of the other people on the panel took issue with that. So we're at a stage which is frankly only just this side of insane in Britain. The great thing about it, though, is that 85 to 90% of the population think this is rubbish, and love Churchill just as much as ever they did.
Yes, yeah, no, it's astonishing, all of these scurrilous attacks on Churchill that we're seeing in the UK and also in the United States as well, on the sort of far left, and with regard to this, you know, this charge that you're seeing from left-wing academics, especially in the UK, that, you know, Churchill was a racist. What's your response to that?
Well, in and of itself, of course it's true that he did believe that there was a hierarchy of the races. He was born at a time when Charles Darwin was still alive and when that was considered scientific fact. But he never did anything unpleasant. He never wanted anything unpleasant to happen to non-white people, which is also pretty much, I think, a definition of racist. He went out of his way to, of course, fight for the abolition of slavery in the River War. He, again and again, when he was Undersecretary for the Colonies, he put the well-being of the native peoples above those of the white settlers. He had a tremendous record of helping the Afridi, the Punjabi tribesmen who were being attacked across the northwest frontier by the Talib and the Afridis. You know, so actually, what he did was prove that he did believe that Black Lives Matter. Whereas he did also make jokes that today we would consider completely unacceptable. You know, we know the idea of a hierarchy of the races is absurd and obscene, but he didn't.
And the issue of course, the culture wars in the UK are sort of front and center now.
And he's at the front line of the front wars. But then he'd be perfectly happy about that, because he was always in the front line of every war.
Right. And of course, Boris Johnson is a big admirer of Winston Churchill, and he's wrote a very successful book, The Churchill Factor, and the British government really is fighting back against cancel culture, against critical race theory, against the sort of left's kind of cultural agenda. And do you think that they're going to succeed in this fight? It's very closely watched, of course, here in the United States, especially among US conservatives. They're looking at what the British Conservative government is doing on all of these issues.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of lessons, of course, for the US. But do you think that the Johnson government is going to succeed, actually, in rolling back the tide of left-wing, attacks on British history and British culture?
It's very difficult to tell, because you're right that the government hates and despises all this wokery. However, we've been in power now for 10 years. You know, there have been 10 years of Conservatives either being the largest power or the only part of the government. And what's happened? You know, we still have these sort of things crop up endlessly. You know, statues that are being attacked and curriculums being so-called colonized, and you know, so actually just winning the elections doesn't seem to help, and that's a worry, because ultimately we're not going to win all elections forever, and so it's going to get so much worse when Labour get back
Yes.
into power. So no, I'm very concerned. We, by the way, are watching you. Don't think it's all one way. When Mr. Youngkin won in Virginia, it was front page news in Britain, because it was seen as a victory against wokery. It was seen as parents rising up and saying enough is enough.
Yes.
And that's something that we very much wanted to have in Britain as well.
Yeah, very significant. As you point out, the number one issue, I think, in the Virginia election was the issue of critical race theory in schools. And I expect it's going to continue to be a very, very large issue in the midterm elections and even the presidential election, the issue of political indoctrination of children by the far left using sort of Marxist ideas. And it strikes me the American people are standing up to that now in a major way, as we saw in Virginia. Andrew, a couple of last questions, then I'm going to invite questions from the audience. But a question on American leadership on the world stage in the wake of what can only be described as the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan and Joe Biden's abysmal handling of that. How big has the damage been? How significant is the damage to America's image in the United Kingdom and on the world stage? And after all, this was really the humiliation of a superpower.
Incredibly profound is the answer. Any friend of any friend of America in Britain, like me, has found it very, very difficult, frankly, after those chaotic scenes at Kabul airport, because anti-Americans who are always there in Britain hold up this as an example of why American imperium is the days are numbered. That there's a sort of sell-by date to American hegemony, and frankly, an awful lot of people on the left would love that to end, to the point that they're willing to close their eyes to the totalitarianism in China, to actually, bring on the day early. And it strikes me that if that should ever happen, if you should have a moment when America loses its primacy in the world, when the dollar's no longer the reserve currency, and so on, you're going to go through the 5 stages of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. You're already starting with denial. One can see that already. Then you're going to have a stage of anger. I wouldn't be surprised if that does happen at the time of the midterms or the next general election. You're going to have an attempt at negotiation, but you can see already the way the Chinese the way they negotiate is, I'm afraid, much tougher than your diplomats are doing. You're going to have a sense of extreme, the 4th stage of the cycle is depression, and maybe an economic depression as well as a metaphysical sense of depression, which I think will hit this country terribly hard when it realizes for the first time since the 1890s it's not the primary nation in the world. And then finally, and the most dangerous moment of the lot, frankly, is acceptance. When you get to that 5th stage of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, then it's all over for America. And that must not happen. You must, as a nation, get yourselves together, because it's not just yourselves you're standing up for. It's timeless concepts, the concepts of the founders. You're standing up for me and Britain and all of your allies and the people who trust in you and believe in you. And right now, all I can see in the thinking as an historian, all I can see for the future of the world is negative.
Yes. It's a very damning indictment, I think, of US leadership, or the lack of it at the moment. How much harm has been done under the present US administration to the US-UK special relationship? After all, the Biden presidency has been very critical of Brexit. It's issued threats over the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Yeah.
Senate Democrats issued another threat over the weekend against the UK, threatening to sink a US-UK free trade agreement if the British government invokes Article 16 on the Northern Ireland Protocol issue. This is an administration that has not been very friendly towards the United Kingdom.
Well, and let's remember what President Obama said as well about sending Britain to the back of the queue,
Yeah.
The back of the line, essentially. Yes, no, we can't hold up much hope for any kind of friendly coexistence with the Biden administration. You're absolutely right. And but the thing is that actually, funny enough, when President Obama made that threat against Britain over Brexit, the numbers for Brexit went up.
Yes.
So you have to remember that simply being threatened and bullied tends not to work with Britain, or at least with Britons, and it certainly won't work with Boris Johnson.
Yes.
So I think that that actually it was a very stupid thing for President Biden to have done with regard to Article 16, because Article 16 is an inherent part of the agreement.
Yeah.
You know, it's not as though you're making some kind of... I don't believe that he understands the Irish situation in the modern sense of it. He might have when he went into politics back in the 1970s, when it was very different. But today, the idea of the Sinn Féin going back to the blankets and letting off bombs because of the checking and testing of European goods coming through across the Irish border is completely ludicrous. You know, so I'm afraid he's stuck in a time warp here, and it's going to be something we just have to wait out. Nobody's expecting a free trade agreement during the Biden administration.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is the the unfortunate state of affairs at the moment, and it's very significant that we actually hosted Nikki Haley just a few days ago for the Margaret Thatcher Freedom Lecture, and she voiced her wholehearted support for Brexit, which she thought was absolutely tremendous, not only for Britain but also for America as well, and also her support for a US-UK free trade agreement. And so there are many conservatives here in the United States who are standing shoulder to shoulder with Great Britain in the Brexit era. And my last question for you...
Well, hang on, can I just...
Go ahead.
Talking about Brexit, and thank you for those kind words, but, you know, it's already proved to be the right thing to have done.
Yes.
Had Britain been in the European Medical Agency, we would not have been able to have got our vaccines as early as we did. The European Medical Agency essentially centralized that whole process and were incredibly slow. They refused to take any risks. They didn't go to enough pharmaceutical companies. They didn't put any money into it. Boris Johnson was able, because of Brexit, therefore, to do all the things that he did to make Britain the third fastest vaccinated country to 80% of our population in the world, and thereby saved, well, some political commentators think more than 10,000 lives, others think fewer, but roughly 10,000 people are alive today because of Brexit who wouldn't have been if Remain had won.
Yeah.
So it's not just a question of airy-fairy stuff to do with trade deals and so on, or anything to do with these Remain concepts of kumbaya, happier as being part of the European Union. It's nothing to do with that. It's actually to do with people who are alive today who would not be were it not for Brexit.
Yes. Excellent points, Andrew. And it's striking how if you look at the Ukraine and Belarus fronts at the moment in Europe, it's Brexit Britain out of all of the European powers who are stepping forward, offering the strongest support for both Ukraine and for Poland in the face of Russian intimidation. And it's an example of how Britain is projecting far greater power, actually, in the Brexit era. And in fact, my last question was going to be about Brexit and what do you think the outlook is going to be for Britain as a sort of resurgent power globally?
Well, I think what we can do now, of course, is decouple from the European-based security concepts, where you only have to look at Nord Stream to realise that Nord Stream 2 to realise that most of the Europeans just will always put short-term interests first, and they don't care about ultimately they don't care about the freedom of countries like Ukraine. Britain, America, the Anglosphere, as it were, are much more concerned about these fundamental rights, it strikes me. And so a Brexit Britain is going to be able to be closer to America and to the other Anglosphere countries than a Remain Britain would have been able to have been. And when you look at France, France is always there when they need you.
Yes. Well, very significant, of course, that the French are knifing Britain actively in the back on the migration issue in the Channel at the moment.
Yes, but that's all a payback for AUKUS, of course, which still makes every patriotic Englishman happy.
Yes, one of the rare good moves actually by the Biden administration, the AUKUS pact, and as you note, Andrew, I think Brexit is actually very bad news for Putin, really. And this idea that the Russians supported Brexit is a complete myth, and the reality is that Brexit Britain is by far the most formidable opponent of Russia in Europe today.
Well, and having said that, also we are, I think, the only European power that they've actually killed our citizens with Novichok on our ground, in our country. That's not something that the French and the Germans have had to deal with yet.
Yeah.
Yet.
Excellent point. And we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and so I've got a number of hands. I'm going to take the we do have a microphone. Take the gentleman in the back first, and then the lady in the middle, and then gentleman over there on this side. So.
Good morning, J.P. Hogan. I want a question mark on the end of your title, because of Bill Clinton's history. Seems to be he wanted autocracy and planned succession, set up his wife for presidency. So I'm also wondering, with Clinton, when he studied in England, did he study how to try to bring America to a different form of government, away from our democracy?
No, I wouldn't have thought for a moment that the Rhodes Scholarship had autocracy for America on its agenda. No, but thank you very much.
We'll take the next question over here, and it's interesting how the Rhodes Scholarships are now under fire as well, and the Rhodes statue has been under fire at Oriel College, although it's still going to be remaining there. But so many US politicians have actually benefited from Rhodes Scholarships, politicians of all races.
Yes, and of course the other thing is that although people want to pull down his statue, they're perfectly willing to use his money.
Yes.
Nobody's sort of offered to give any of that back.
Yeah, precisely. Yes, go ahead.
Morning, Natalie Liu. I'm a foreign affairs writer at Voice of America. And two questions. One, if Washington takes a softer stance towards Beijing, do you foresee the UK necessarily follow Washington's quote-unquote example, either out of the concern or consideration of alignment, or out of the need or desire not to stick its own neck out? That's question one.
Can I answer question one first, because I'll forget question two if I don't know it. I think we have actually been a bit tougher over Hong Kong for obvious historical reasons. We are on the verge of, the Foreign Office isn't, but Parliament is on the verge of describing the Uyghur treatment as genocide, which the United States isn't ready to do yet, I don't think. And there are areas. We've been a bit tougher also on the telecommunications giant Huawei. And so I think that although we, of course, can't decouple from American policy towards China, and we've seen from the way that the Australians have been treated by the Chinese that they are a vicious power when it comes to feeling that they've been crossed. I think that so far the Boris Johnson ministry has been pretty good with regard to China. Sorry, your second question.
A second question concerns NATO. Can I hold it? Or I hear the echo so much. What's the UK's? How do you see the UK's role evolving in current day NATO? Is the UK itself preoccupied with COVID and with post Brexit? Is the UK still holding up its role vigorously within the NATO? Thank you.
More than vigorously post Brexit, because of course, as we don't have close economic ties with the European Union, we still have very important security ties with the vast majority of countries. And so, if anything, actually, we, I think, are going to be better NATO allies because it's really NATO that's kept the peace in Europe. We must forget this ridiculous concept that it's the European Union. It isn't. It's been NATO since 1949, which, of course, predates the European Union, apart from anything else. And my only real concern is that we're still expecting American taxpayers to pick up the tab for NATO, essentially. You know, you have some countries in Europe, Italy, Liechtenstein's another one, I think the Spanish as well are pretty low, who are paying 1.1% of their GDP to NATO, whereas American taxpayers are having to pick up the tab, essentially 4.4% sometimes. So Britain, I'm pleased to say, is at the 2% level, but that's only if you slightly cook the books and include stuff like intelligence and pensions and for war widows and things like that. That's not real, cutting edge fighting expenditure. So my sense is that the best way for Britain to be a really active leader in NATO, which it wants to be, is to stump up a bit more cash. And we have, there is an enormous amount that is knocking about, which is being misspent, I think, in this country, in Britain.
Sorry.
I think we'll probably move on to the next question. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Aaron Koreva. I used to be with the McCain Institute. Very interesting topics. I apologize for coming in late and maybe disturbing the lecture, but our metro or tube is not as good as the one in London, so unfortunately. My question is about the future of the United Kingdom, specifically thinking about Scottish independence movement, and seems to be fueled a little bit by Brexit and kind of resentment towards Boris Johnson, maybe in the way he's handling things. So can you talk a little bit about that? Where do you see this going?
Yes, I think that Scottish independence has been fueled by resentment about one thing or another for a very long time, including obviously Margaret Thatcher in the old days. I think that the Scots tend to resent there ever being a Tory prime minister in the first place, and so when there is, you get increased numbers for independence. When it actually comes to it, though, finally, whether or not they really want to break up what has been historically one of the most successful unions, political unions of any two countries in the history of the world, I wonder. When they recognize that they could wind up even if they are allowed into the European Union, which isn't certain. There's no reason, for example, why Spain should want to encourage Catalonia by letting the Scots join. But even assuming they did, why would they want to become a small satrapy of a gigantic European superstate rather than be a valued and important partner in a very successful power? It doesn't make any sort of sense. But then, you know, these arguments sometimes north of the border don't make much sense.
So, I should mention that actually Stephen Groves is our Margaret Thatcher Fellow.
Thank you, and thanks for speaking at Heritage today. And I look forward to reading your book. But the central premise of the book seems to be that America, broke away from George III and England, not because they had legitimate grievances, but because they could. And that's of course, not how it's taught here in the States. And so I'm wondering if it's your contention that the protesting against the Stamp Act and the long list of grievances in our Declaration of Independence were merely pretextual.
Yes, the Stamp Act was intended to raise between 40 and 50,000 pounds, which from the 1.9 million non-slaved Americans was a tiny amount, sort of like two shillings and sixpence per person per year, every penny of which was going to be spent in America protecting Americans. So as far as the actual taxation issue is concerned, it was the American colonies were amongst the freest in the world, as I mentioned earlier, amongst the lowest taxed. They were paying something like 2% of the taxation in Britain at the time. Virtually no bureaucracy. You had some 17 people in Virginia, and I think about 40 in South Carolina, who were paid by the king, who were administrators and bureaucrats in the entire province. And yet you wanted, quite rightly, it was the right moment for historical development of America to become independent. And therefore, this is a very pro-American book, in fact. And I think it makes, as I mentioned earlier, it makes America, all the more exceptional a power. Of the 28 clauses, the American Declaration of Independence is one of the most beautiful documents, beautifully written documents in history. It's Shakespearean in its language, it's sublime, it makes you feel proud. That opening third of it makes you feel proud to be human. And then after that, you have the next two-thirds with 28 charges, only 2 of which actually hold water. There is a lot of ex post facto rationalization. There's a lot of things accusing the king of things that every British monarch since Elizabeth I had been guilty of in America. There are some things that are just completely invented. There's the clause about taking people across the oceans for trial. Not a single person had been taken across the ocean for trial in the whole of George III's reign. But those 2 things that are true, the one about taxation in the 17th charge, and the one about Parliament having the right to veto American legislation, the 22nd charge, in and of themselves justify the American Revolution. I go into this in great detail in chapter 13, which I think you'll enjoy, I hope.
Thank you. Professor Leconte.
Thanks so much. I got it, it's okay, thanks. Joe Lacani, Director of the Center for American Studies here at Heritage. Thanks so much for coming, Andrew Roberts. You write these beautiful volumes faster than I can read them, so congratulations on the book. As an historian myself, I'm curious to know King George as not an absolute monarch, but part of a constitutional monarchy. I don't think that's kind of widely maybe understood or appreciated on the American side. What would you say is the sort of cultural, political debt that the Americans owed to that constitutional monarchy tradition that and part of that question would be, was King George reinforcing the revolution of 1688, the Glorious Revolution? Is he reinforcing it, or is he undercutting it in some way with his rule?
He's very good question, he's very much reinforcing it. He sees William III and the Glorious Revolution as being something to revere, owing to the fact that it creates the limited monarchy, and the Constitution gives him an enormous amount of power, of course. Although I noticed in the Harvard Law Review last April that, in fact, George III has fewer powers than the American president, the imperial presidency today. But nonetheless, he did have huge powers, and so that you have the fascinating situation that he clothes himself in the Glorious Revolution, the mantle of those revolutionaries, who, of course, ultimately brought his family to the throne, whilst the founding fathers were doing exactly the same thing. They very much wanted to be seen as the heirs to the revolution against Charles I of 1642 and James II of 1688. And so in order to do that, you have to, in the Declaration, attempt to make George III out to be a kind of Stuart absolutist style of monarch who believes in the divine right of kings and so on. But clearly he didn't believe in the divine right of kings. He was a Hanoverian monarch, and he was in no sense an absolutist. So you have these two sets of people who are fighting one another for the sort of right to be seen as the heirs to 1688.
Sorry, in fact, I think we have time probably for just, well, let's take these last two questions. So Bob Moffat and Hella Dale, yeah.
Good morning, Bob Moffat. I'm a senior fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, and I admire everything you've written. I'm halfway through Napoleon right now.
Thank you.
In any event, there are British troops right now in Poland, and there's a lot of tension in Eastern Europe that I think a lot of Americans are not paying attention to. What I would like to know from you is this: looking over the horizon, how do you see Poland as a power in Europe evolving?
Yes, well, I mean, it is under severe threat deliberately from Lukashenko, who obviously does want to use these refugee crisis as a way of putting pressure on Poland, either because he's a puppet of Putin's or for his own reasons to try and get the EU to lift these sanctions against him. And it strikes me, therefore, that Poland is on the front line, both geographically, obviously, but also sort of metaphorically on the front line of the great struggle against Putinism, and I can't see that changing anytime soon. I think it would be a disaster if these refugees from Syria and elsewhere, some of them from Afghanistan, are allowed over the wire and into Poland, because then you're going to have the most atrocious social problems in Poland, and those could get very nasty very soon. You know, there is a strain of Polish nationalism which will not put up with that, frankly. So it strikes me that now is the time to be four square behind Poland. I think NATO's got to do that. I think the way in which the British have been putting troops in there is admirable. And I'd like lots more countries to do it too, because you know, it is totally, you know, frontline state.
Very well said, Andrew. Last question, Hella.
Yes. It strikes me as being absolutely bang on the money. We went through the 5 stages. In a way, fortunately, we could get through the denial stage very quickly because of the Suez crisis. And then you have anger, which you did get with the Conservative Party almost splitting in the 1950s. Each of the stages comes. You get. We fortunately did manage to get to acceptance after the Falklands War, because there was a marvelous sort of moment where we were proven by Margaret Thatcher not to be a completely sort of wet and weak power, We had the capacity to stand up for Britain's, in some places of the far-flung empire. But frankly, we went through all of those 5 stages between 1956 and 1979, and it was not a happy time, especially the 1970s. And I pray America doesn't have to do that. And it's not difficult not to. It's not as though it wasn't a deliberate throwing away of an extraordinary opportunity in Afghanistan. You had not lost a single American dead soldier in 18 months. And yet you lose 13 in one day because of the botched operation forced on the army by Biden. It's an extraordinary story. It's something that historians will be racking their brains over how it could ever have happened hundreds of years from now, I believe.
Thank you very much. I'm going to unfortunately have to bring our event to a close. We've run out of time. And Andrew, it's been a tremendous, wide-ranging discussion from George III to Joe Biden to Brexit to Meghan Markle. We've covered practically everything today. And we do have a few books available for signing outside. And a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us in person and online. We have several hundred people watching online today. Thank you very much for joining us. Our next event for online viewing is our event with the UK Home Secretary Priti Patel, which will be this Friday, 11 a.m. US time. I hope that many of you can join us for that discussion as well. And Andrew, wish you all the best with your book tour here in the United States. And I think this is this is an incredible book. It's going to have a very big impact, and wish you every success with the launch of your book here in the US.
Thank you very much indeed. You're going to have a treat with Priti Patel. She's fantastic. I think a future leader as well, and so somebody who I think you'll really enjoy listening to. And I've hugely enjoyed today. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.